Imagine being trapped on an island controlled by Japanese soldiers, a place where every escape attempt ends in execution. A prison camp so brutal that the prisoners themselves have completely lost hope of surviving. But everything changes the day a man arrives on the island. A fighter capable of taking on several soldiers by himself. A man so dangerous that even the Japanese colonel running the camp begins to fear him. And what nobody realizes yet is that this man is about to turn the entire camp into a real battlefield. The movie begins with a group of Japanese soldiers chasing a prisoner named John through the forest. In an attempt to escape, John creates a diversion by throwing a brick in their direction before suddenly lunging at them. He manages to kill the first soldier, then throws the second one directly onto a landmine, which explodes instantly. But it doesn't take long for John to realize that the entire forest is swarming with Japanese soldiers, far more than he originally expected. With no other option left, he is forced to run for his life. A few moments later, the soldiers manage to completely surround him. They point their weapons at him and force him to surrender. However, their commander decides not to kill him immediately and instead orders his men to capture him alive and bring him back to the camp. Once they arrive at the camp, the movie shows the prisoners occupied with the only form of entertainment they still have left, organizing spider fights on a small wooden board. It's the only thing that allows them to forget, even for a brief moment, the misery of their daily lives. From the moment he arrives, John immediately draws attention. Colonel Kiochi quickly notices that this new prisoner is far from ordinary. Just by the way he carries himself, Kiochi realizes that John is a former British Air Force commander, someone who has always been used to giving orders rather than obeying them. Fearing that John's presence could threaten the camp's authority, Kiochi secretly orders his men to take him deep into the forest and execute him away from prying eyes. Once they reach an isolated area, John drops to his knees and pretends to calmly accept his fate. In reality, though, he's simply waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The instant one of the soldiers swings his sword at him, John dodges the attack and brutally kills all three men with shocking violence. Even with his hands still tied, he manages to escape into the forest once again before eventually finding the wreckage of his crashed plane. But his escape attempt suddenly comes to an end when he falls into a hidden trap set up by the Japanese soldiers. His knife slips from his hands, and the soldiers immediately take advantage of the situation to overpower him before dragging him back to the camp. Once they stand before Colonel Kiochi, they inform him that John managed to kill 3 Japanese soldiers. Hearing this deeply shocks Kiochi. He removes the chain John is wearing and discovers a military medal awarded for bravery in combat. The colonel then tells him that by killing those soldiers, men he considered his own brothers, he had made the greatest mistake of his life. Despite his anger, Kiochi declares that John will remain alive until the following day before facing execution. After that conversation, Kiochi orders his men to take John away. At that moment, one of the soldiers suggests killing him immediately if the colonel wishes. But Kiochi firmly refuses. He explains that he first wants John to fight the camp's greatest warrior in front of all the prisoners. According to Kiochi, publicly humiliating John before his death would serve as a warning and remind every prisoner what happens to anyone foolish enough to challenge the Japanese. John is then taken to a prison cell, where he meets the other inmates, most of whom are American soldiers. They explain that before they arrived, other prisoners had already been held in the camp, but the Japanese eventually executed every single one of them. When they see John, they begin hoping that maybe he has come to rescue them. But John quickly destroys those hopes. He explains that he never came there by choice. Before all this, he was flying a military aircraft until the Japanese shot it down, forcing him to parachute onto the island. By now, his superiors probably believe he is dead, which means no one is coming to save him. The prisoners then explain that inside the camp, everyone shares whatever little they have in order to survive. They also tell him about a man named Collins, who is considered the leader of the prisoners, and mention that John will most likely meet him the following day. John admits that Kiochi is probably planning to execute him for killing several Japanese soldiers, unless there is some way to escape the place. But the prisoners quickly explain that escaping the cell itself is not really the hardest part. The real problem is that they are trapped on an isolated island completely controlled by Japanese troops. Everyone who tried to escape before was eventually captured and executed. Over time, the prisoners came to understand that obeying orders and working for the Japanese was their only chance to stay alive. They are forced to build barricades and tents for the camp. They also mention another location somewhere on the island known as the Death March Camp. No one knows exactly what happens there, but everyone has heard the same rumor. Anyone sent there never comes back. The next morning, John is awakened by the shouting and sounds of Japanese soldiers training under Colonel Kiyoshi's command. Shortly afterward, the guards tie his hands and escort him to the center of a fighting ring. But unexpectedly, Kiyoshi orders the guards to untie him and temporarily pull him away from the ring. According to the colonel, the time for John's true punishment has not arrived yet. Instead, Kiyoshi decides to punish 3 prisoners accused of stealing extra food. However, their punishment is not immediate execution. Kiyoshi prefers to have them face the most feared fighter in the camp, a Japanese warrior notorious for his extreme brutality and complete lack of mercy. The Japanese fighter steps forward and stares down the prisoners as if to make it clear that they have absolutely no chance against him. Within the very first moments of the fight, he knocks the first prisoner to the ground with terrifying ease. The blows he receives seem to have no effect on him whatsoever. Without even using a weapon, he kills all 3 prisoners almost effortlessly. Through this savage display of violence, the Japanese are sending a very clear message. This is the fate awaiting anyone who dares to steal from the soldiers in the camp. After this bloody display, it is finally John's turn to fight. But contrary to what Kiochi expected, the battle immediately takes an unexpected turn. From the very first exchange, John strikes the Japanese fighter with such force that he sends him crashing to the ground in front of the stunned prisoners and soldiers. Colonel Kiochi stands frozen, unable to hide his shock. In that exact moment, he realizes that John is far more than an ordinary soldier. He is a man highly trained in martial arts. John remains calm, slowly repositions himself, then delivers a single finishing blow that completely defeats his opponent. The victory comes so quickly that it sends shockwaves through the entire camp. Furious with rage, Kiochi storms back to his tent while the soldiers remain speechless, still trying to process what they just witnessed. One of the soldiers then suggests to the colonel that it would be wiser to kill John immediately before he becomes even more dangerous. But Kiochi sees things differently. Despite his anger, he cannot help but respect John's strength and abilities. He insists that John's time will come eventually, and that even if he survives today, death will catch up with him sooner or later. A little later, John finally meets Collins, the man considered the leader of the prisoners. Impressed by what he saw in the arena, Collins admits that he's relieved to have John among them. He struggles to walk because an explosion some time earlier badly damaged his leg. Curious, Collins asks John where he learned how to fight. He explains that he has spent months in this camp and has never seen anyone defeat a Japanese fighter the way John just did. John then reveals that he trained in several Asian countries, including Hong Kong, Thailand, and Japan. Shortly after their conversation, soldiers come to escort John back in front of Colonel Kiochi once again. The colonel repeats the exact same question about his combat training. But once again, John refuses to answer. Kiochi's eyes then fall on John's chain and military medal. When John demands that they be returned to him, the colonel immediately refuses. He claims to recognize the fighting style John uses and explains that it is a forbidden Japanese combat technique, banned from the battlefield. Annoyed by John's defiant attitude and his constant refusal to show any respect, Kiochi strikes him violently across the face before warning him once again that he was granting him one more day to live, but that his death would inevitably come. The following morning, John is escorted back to the ring for a second fight. As he leaves his cell, he hears the prisoners shouting his name and cheering him on with excitement. But this time, the match is completely unfair. 3 Japanese soldiers are ordered to fight him at the same time. Despite being outnumbered, John quickly takes control of the battle. Within only a few minutes, he manages to overpower all 3 men. At one point, he completely dominates one of the soldiers and could easily kill him, but he deliberately chooses to spare his life. Instead of finishing him off, John simply beats him down, displaying the full extent of his strength in front of the Japanese soldiers. This new humiliation drives Kiochi into a furious rage. Unable to tolerate what he has just witnessed, the colonel storms back into his tent once again. A little later, Collins asks John why he decided to spare the Japanese soldiers when he clearly had the chance to kill them. John explains that the men were ultimately just following the orders of their superior. In his eyes, those soldiers were not so different from the prisoners themselves. They were also afraid of dying and willing to do anything to survive. But not long afterward, an event proves just how ruthless Kiochi truly is. Without the slightest hesitation, he personally executes the Japanese soldiers who had been defeated by John. Through this act, he clearly shows that he is incapable of feeling any compassion, even toward his own men. Meanwhile, a prisoner named Steve tells John that both he and Collins will soon be transferred to another camp because their injuries have made them less useful there. Steve still hopes that this new place might be less terrible than the current one. But Collins immediately crushes that illusion. According to him, no one has ever returned alive from that camp, and he is convinced the Japanese will probably kill them before they even get there. Hearing this, John realizes he is running out of time. He explains to the prisoners that he absolutely needs a radio. According to him, if Allied forces are already near the coast, sending out a signal could be their only chance of being rescued. He reveals that he spotted a radio inside the soldiers' guard tower and plans to steal it. Steve and Collins eventually agree to help him, and John immediately begins preparing his plan. The next day, the prisoners put their strategy into motion by staging a violent fight in the middle of the camp. From their tower, the guards instantly believe a real riot has broken out and divert their attention to intervene. Using the distraction to his advantage, John quietly slips toward the guard tower and successfully steals the radio without being noticed. Meanwhile, the soldiers fire warning shots into the air to scatter the prisoners and break up the fake fight. As he climbs back down to hide, John crosses paths with the camp nurse. He then discovers that a Japanese soldier is trying to assault her. When she refuses to submit, the soldier brutally strikes her with a pen. John is deeply disturbed by what he sees and wants to step in immediately to protect her. However, he realizes that reacting now would completely ruin his plan. Before leaving, all he can do is promise her that he will try to save everyone. Afterward, John carefully hides the radio before quietly returning to his tent without drawing any suspicion from the soldiers. Later that night, another prisoner approaches him, clearly worried. He explains that if someone used the radio to send a signal, the Japanese would eventually realize it had gone missing, and everyone would likely be tortured in retaliation. But John immediately tries to reassure the prisoners. According to him, the soldiers own so much equipment that they probably would not even notice the disappearance of a single radio. He urges them not to lose hope despite the situation. However, the very next morning, Colonel Kiochi suddenly gathers all the prisoners along with every soldier in the camp, as though he is preparing to make an important announcement. Standing before everyone, Kiochi declares that he has noticed certain prisoners secretly moving through restricted areas of the camp. Shortly afterward, a soldier violently drags a prisoner in front of him. The colonel makes it clear that the man still has a chance to survive, but only if he reveals the identity of the prisoner who broke the rules. He openly threatens him, stating that if he refuses to speak, he will be executed immediately. Terrified, the prisoner finally gives up Lopez's name. The moment Lopez is captured, Kiochi reveals his true nature. Contrary to what he had implied, he immediately orders both men to be executed with swords in front of the entire camp so their deaths can serve as an example to the other prisoners. He then announces that any prisoner caught disobeying the camp's rules would suffer the exact same punishment. Later that night, John quietly questions his companion Boehner in order to understand how the two prisoners managed to move around the camp without being spotted by the guards. Boehner then reveals that there is a blind spot in the camp's surveillance system and that the prisoners had been using that area to move around discreetly without attracting the soldiers' attention. The moment he learns this, John immediately decides to use that weakness to attempt his own escape. A few hours later, deep in the middle of the night, he carefully prepares everything. He arranges his blanket on the bed to make the guards believe he is still sleeping inside his cell. Then he retrieves the stolen radio, quietly leaves the room, and cautiously moves behind the soldiers before slipping out of the camp and disappearing into the forest. Once he is far enough away, John finally turns on the radio. He immediately hears several voices speaking in Navarro, a coded language used by the American military. Realizing that Allied forces are probably somewhere near the island, he quickly decides to return to the wreckage of the plane he had previously discovered in the forest. As he carefully examines the destroyed aircraft, John notices a special hook designed for ground towing. At that exact moment, a plan that is both dangerous and completely insane suddenly comes to mind, using the wrecked plane as their only way to escape the island. Meanwhile, back at the camp, a soldier enters the cell to inspect the prisoners. The moment he pulls the blanket off John's bed, he immediately realizes that John has escaped. Yet, strangely enough, he chooses not to raise the alarm and simply walks away from the cell as though nothing happened. A short time later, John manages to sneak back into the camp without being detected. The following morning, he finally shares his idea with Collins and Steve. He explains that he is now convinced American forces are somewhere near the island because only American soldiers use the Navarro language in their communications. He then tells them about the plane wreck hidden in the forest and the special hook attached to it. His plan sounds simple, at least in theory. Convince an American pilot to fly low enough for them to attach the wrecked aircraft and be pulled off the island. Even though the plan sounds completely unrealistic and incredibly dangerous, Collins and Steve quickly realize they have nothing left to lose. They agree to help John carry out the escape attempt. But their conversation is suddenly interrupted when several soldiers arrive to escort John back in front of Colonel Kiochi. This time, Kiochi behaves very differently. Much calmer, almost respectful, he invites John to sit down before asking him whether he understands the Navarro language. He explains that he has recently heard it being used over military radio transmissions. Without hesitation, John lies and claims that he has absolutely no idea what the language is. He even adds that if he truly understood it, he would have no reason whatsoever to help the Japanese. Kiochi then changes his strategy. He promises John that if he agrees to cooperate, he could leave the camp alive and regain his freedom. But at the same time, he warns him that if he continues to stay silent, he will never see his family again. Kiochi also explains that even if John somehow survives this camp, he will eventually be transferred to the terrible Death March camp, a place from which no prisoner has ever returned alive. Faced with those threats, John calmly replies that he is doomed no matter what happens, and that he already knows Kiochi never keeps his promises. He then declares that he will never help him, and that he will continue fighting his soldiers until every single one of them falls. Those words immediately ignite the colonel's anger. Furious, Kiochi orders the guards to take John away before violently slamming his fist onto the table in a burst of rage. After that, he declares that John is no longer his main concern. According to Kiochi, the real threat is no longer John, but the American and British forces moving dangerously close to the island and capable of launching an attack at any moment. To him, every Navarro transmission he hears is a sign that disaster is approaching. Shortly afterward, the soldiers tie John up and begin torturing him under the colonel's direct orders. They beat him mercilessly with wooden sticks while he endures the pain without being able to fight back. Very quickly, his body becomes covered in bruises and wounds. Exhausted from the beating, he eventually collapses to his knees in agony. But the soldiers refuse to stop there. After humiliating him, they untie his restraints so they can continue the beating even more brutally. Yet, against all expectations, John suddenly explodes with rage. He violently rips the sticks out of the soldiers' hands and turns their own brutality against them. With incredible strength, he beats them savagely, snaps the sticks against their bodies, and humiliates them in front of the other soldiers. At one point, he even grabs one of the men by the throat and begins choking him without taking his eyes off Kiochi. Even then, however, John still refuses to kill him. Another soldier suddenly steps in and finally manages to force John to the ground. He immediately asks the colonel for permission to execute him, but once again, Kiochi refuses to give the order. In reality, the colonel is becoming less and less capable of enduring this humiliation. For the third time, John has once again proven that he is superior to them. Unable to control his anger any longer, Kiochi turns his rage toward the prisoners instead. Consumed by fury, he personally shoots several detainees with his weapon before announcing to the survivors that they were all about to experience something even worse than death. Completely exhausted from the torture he has just endured, John eventually loses consciousness. Several days later, he wakes up inside the camp infirmary. The nurse explains that she injected him with morphine to keep him asleep and allow his body to recover at least a little. She then reveals something particularly surprising. It was Kiochi himself who ordered John to be transferred to the infirmary, even though that place is normally reserved exclusively for Japanese soldiers. The nurse, whose name is Teresa, begins treating John many wounds. She explains that she has been trapped on the island for 3 months already, not as part of the military, but as a prisoner herself. The Japanese force her to work for them by taking care of the wounded soldiers in the camp. As she looks at John's condition, she admits with genuine admiration that it takes incredible mental strength to dare challenge Colonel Kiochi the way he did. John slowly manages to sit up before asking Teresa whether she truly believes Kiochi would ever allow her to leave the island alive. But the instant she hears the question, her expression changes completely. Terrified, she admits that she does not believe she will ever leave the island alive. Their conversation is suddenly interrupted when a soldier enters the infirmary, forcing Teresa to step away immediately without being able to continue speaking. In the middle of the night, John is suddenly awakened by gunfire. As he opens his eyes, he notices a soldier standing near his bed holding a sword. A few seconds later, Kiochi appears as well. Confused, John asks what is happening. The colonel calmly explains that he has just ordered the execution of several prisoners so the others would fully understand the consequences of attempting to escape. Kiochi then adds that he still intends to let John rest for the night because another trial awaits him very soon. According to him, John will remain alive today, but probably not tomorrow. John immediately interrupts him, reminding him that he has already repeated that same threat several times before. He then directly asks why Kiochi continues to give him chances to survive and why he insists on creating all these challenges instead of simply killing him immediately. Kiochi responds seriously that John is an exceptionally well-trained fighter whose strength far surpasses that of the other prisoners. In his eyes, it would be dishonorable to execute such a man without giving him the opportunity to defend himself. He goes on to explain that every fight organized so far had a specific purpose, allowing John to die honorably in hand-to-hand combat. John coldly replies that if Kiochi keeps sending soldiers after him, he will eventually kill every single one of them, until only the two of them remain. And when that moment comes, he will finally be able to return home in peace. Kiochi then admits that he already knows American forces are gradually moving closer to the island. But according to him, the prisoners should feel the exact same fear as the Japanese soldiers. He declares that if the Americans attack the camp, no prisoner will be spared. In his mind, they will all die together. After this conversation, John is escorted back to his cell. The other prisoners then tell him that while he was gone, several American planes flew over the island and dropped leaflets aimed at the Japanese soldiers. The messages accused the Japanese of imprisoning American and British soldiers, torturing them, and forcing them into labor. For the prisoners, the appearance of those planes finally represents real hope. Some of them begin to believe that rescue may actually be coming. But John quickly crushes that optimism by repeating exactly what Kiochi told him. If the Americans attack the camp, the Japanese will kill every prisoner before dying themselves. Those words immediately plunged the prisoners into deep despair. Later that night, John and Steve quietly leave their cell in an attempt to contact the American military using the stolen radio. They move carefully through the camp, trying to avoid the guards. But at one point, a soldier spots them. John is forced to strike the man to stop him from raising the alarm. Afraid that their presence has already been discovered, Steve immediately decides to kill the soldier to ensure he can never speak again. But only moments later, they realize another guard heard the noise and has begun suspecting something. John and Steve manage to intercept him as well. However, this time John absolutely refuses to kill him. Instead, he threatens the soldier, making it clear that he must stay silent if he wants to stay alive. Against all expectations, the soldier agrees to cooperate. Deep down, he also wants to see the prisoners regain their freedom, so he secretly decides to help them. A few minutes later, several guards enter the cell to check on the prisoners. Fortunately, John and Steve had already managed to slip back into their beds before the inspection began. Once the guards leave, John calmly explains to Steve that he now has a very specific plan in mind. The following day, the situation suddenly spirals out of control when the soldiers arrest Collins. Shortly afterward, Kiochi gathers all the prisoners along with his men and announces that certain detainees escaped from their cell during the night and murdered one of the camp soldiers. According to him, it is obvious that at least 2 prisoners were involved in the operation. He then demands to know who was with Collins. Without hesitation, John immediately takes the blame upon himself. He insists that he alone was responsible and repeatedly claims that Collins had absolutely nothing to do with it. But Kiochi flatly refuses to believe him. In order to push John to his limit, the colonel has another prisoner dragged in front of him and orders John to personally kill the man using his forbidden fighting style. He then threatens to execute Collins if John refuses to obey. John remains completely motionless. So, without showing the slightest hesitation, a Japanese soldier coldly shoots the prisoner in front of everyone. Moments later, the guards prepare to execute Collins as well. But Collins refuses to die without fighting back. Consumed by uncontrollable rage, he throws himself at the soldiers with all his strength, overturns the tent, and violently attacks the men surrounding him. The entire camp immediately descends into chaos. Eventually, the guards manage to regain control of the situation and instantly order all the prisoners back into their cells. A little later, John once again tries to convince Kiochi to spare Collins' life. But the colonel firmly refuses. In his eyes, Collins broke the camp's rules, and the only acceptable punishment is death. John finally provokes Kiochi directly by challenging him to face him alone in a real one-on-one duel. But Kiochi remains cautious. He knows perfectly well that such a fight could end badly for him. Instead of accepting the challenge, he chooses to strike John in the head while the guards hold him down. Right in front of everyone, John calls him a coward. Afterward, the soldiers escort John outside the camp. Not long later, he reunites with Steve and explains that they no longer have any other option left. That very night, they absolutely must send a signal to the American forces and communicate with them in Navarro. John explains to Steve that even if the Japanese intercept the transmission, it would take them far too long to crack the code being used. According to him, that delay alone would give the Americans enough time to reach the island. That same night, John and Steve quietly leave their cell and disappear into the forest with the radio. Once they are safely hidden, they desperately attempt to contact the American military. To prevent the Japanese from understanding their conversation, they communicate in Navarro along with several other coded languages completely incomprehensible to the enemy. Eventually, they manage to send out a distress signal using the secret code. Against all odds, someone answers them. Realizing immediately that this is probably their only chance of survival, John quickly transmits their exact location. After finishing the transmission, he and Steve quietly make their way back toward the camp. But when they finally reach the cell, an unsettling sight awaits them. The place is completely empty. Not a single prisoner remains inside. Before they even have time to understand what is happening, several soldiers suddenly ambush them, beat them violently, and knock them unconscious. The next morning, John finally regains consciousness to the sound of airplanes flying over the island. He and Steve are tied to chairs when they suddenly see Teresa and another nurse rushing into the room to free them. Teresa quickly reveals that American aircraft have begun bombing the Japanese positions and that a massive battle has erupted around the camp. Instantly understanding how critical the situation has become, John decides that he absolutely must find a working radio in order to organize their escape and try to save the prisoners who are still alive. As soon as they leave the building, they are met with a horrifying scene. While explosions shake the entire island, Japanese soldiers are already executing several prisoners. John, Steve, and the nurses carefully move through the chaos, doing everything they can to avoid the explosions and the constant gunfire erupting around them. At one point, John discovers a radio, but it has already been completely destroyed. He immediately realizes that only one option remains: reaching the guard tower, where another working radio is almost certainly still available. The problem is that several Japanese soldiers are still stationed inside the tower. Thinking quickly, Teresa and the other nurse improvise a distraction. Pretending to be badly wounded, they approach the guards while struggling to walk. As soon as one of the soldiers comes down to help them, they seize the opportunity to catch him off guard and kill him instantly. Using the opening they created, John and Steve rush into the tower and successfully recover the radio. Steve quickly manages to contact an American aircraft and asks the pilot to tow the crashed plane John had discovered earlier in the forest. At that exact moment, they spot several prisoners about to be executed by Japanese soldiers. John reacts immediately and takes out the guards from a distance, saving the prisoners' lives just in time. Within moments, the entire camp descends into total chaos. Gunfire erupts everywhere. Some prisoners manage to grab weapons and begin fighting back against the Japanese soldiers themselves. Meanwhile, Collins comes face to face with one of the men who had tortured him for months. A savage and brutal fight breaks out between them. Despite all his injuries, Collins eventually gains the upper hand and prepares to finish his opponent once and for all. But before he can land the final blow, several Japanese soldiers open fire on him. Collins is killed instantly. At the same time, John heads straight toward Colonel Kiochi's tent, determined to settle things with him once and for all. But Kiochi is already waiting for him. Standing calmly with a sword in his hand, the colonel prepares for the confrontation. Before the duel even begins, he tosses a second sword to John so they can fight on equal terms. A vicious battle immediately erupts between the two men. Their blades crash violently against each other as both fighters struggle for dominance. But as the fight continues, Kiochi slowly realizes that he cannot match John's strength or experience. Cornered, he secretly attempts to draw his pistol in order to turn the fight around. But John reacts instantly and stops him before he can fire. In the end, Kiochi is defeated. Yet John does not stop there. Overwhelmed by months of rage and suffering, he continues punching the colonel repeatedly in the face with uncontrollable fury. Steve quickly steps in and forces John to leave with him, reminding him that a large number of American planes are already approaching the camp. As they attempt to escape, a Japanese soldier raises his weapon and prepares to shoot them. But unexpectedly, Kiochi himself intervenes and prevents the soldier from firing. Even in defeat, he refuses to let John die without honor. John, Steve, Teresa, and the other nurse then sprint through the forest before firing a flare into the sky to attract the attention of the American aircraft overhead. Eventually, they reach the crashed plane and securely attach a rope to the towing hook. Afterward, they all climb inside the damaged aircraft and wait anxiously for an American pilot to respond to their signal. A few moments later, several Japanese soldiers arrive at the scene. But before they can do anything, the American planes open fire and eliminate them instantly. As John looks over the bodies, he realizes with sadness that the Japanese soldier who secretly helped them earlier is among the dead. The discovery deeply affects him. Finally, one of the American planes descends low enough to hook its cable onto the rope connected to the wrecked aircraft. Slowly, the plane begins lifting off the ground. Inside, John and the others burst with joy. After everything they had endured, they were finally about to escape that living hell. But despite the victory, John knows very well that they failed to save every prisoner left behind on the island. At that moment, he silently promises himself that one day, he will come back for them. 8 years later, after the war has finally ended, John returns to Japan. He walks into a karate dojo, interrupting the students' training before asking for information about Colonel Kiochi. He explains that he still has unfinished business with him. The master of the dojo then reveals that Kiochi was actually his father. John simply replies that he knew the man during the war. The dojo master goes on to explain that his father spoke about John many times and considered him an extraordinarily powerful fighter. But despite that admiration, resentment still remains. Without warning, the master orders his students to attack John, claiming that his father suffered for the rest of his life because of him. John effortlessly takes on every student in the dojo. One after another, he overpowers them and breaks their bones with terrifying ease. Eventually, the master steps in to stop the fight before finally revealing that Kiochi died a year earlier. Before his death, the colonel had spoken about John at great length. After hearing this revelation, John prepares to quietly leave the dojo. But just as he is about to walk away, the master stops him and explains that he also wanted the chance to face the legendary fighter his father talked about constantly. John accepts the challenge. The master immediately attacks using his deadliest techniques. Yet John blocks every single strike with incredible ease before quickly gaining the upper hand. He could have killed him without difficulty, but instead, he chooses to spare his life. At that moment, the master finally realizes that his father had been telling the truth all along. John truly was an exceptional warrior. The master then reveals that Kiochi often said John would one day return to reclaim what belonged to him. He brings out the chain and the medal of honor that Kiochi had taken from John years earlier. Handing them back, he explains that his father carefully kept them all this time, secretly waiting for John to return one day. In the end, the two men exchange a deep mutual respect. John quietly takes back his belongings and silently walks away from the dojo. In the end, this story is not only about war, survival, or combat. More than anything, it is about the mental strength of a man who refused to give up, even after losing almost everything. John could have surrendered to fear, accepted his fate, and waited for death like many of the other prisoners. But despite the torture, humiliation, and brutality of the camp, he kept fighting, not only for himself, but also to give the others a chance to survive. And maybe that is the true lesson of the film. Even in the darkest situations, as long as someone still holds on to hope and refuses to surrender, nothing is truly lost. Colonel Kiochi believed fear was the greatest way to control people, but John proved the exact opposite. Because in the end, courage, loyalty, and the determination to remain human will always be stronger than terror. And sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to resist to completely change the fate of everyone else. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more movie recaps like this one. And let us know in the comments, if you were in John's place, would you have had the courage to try escaping that island?